Okay, welcome everybody, and on behalf of the UN and the Arab World Program here at the IFI, would like to welcome you here and apologize for the slight delay, but Beirut traffic is always something that everybody who comes to Beirut has to negotiate. I'm not going to introduce John Pace, who we're extremely happy to have here. I've had the pleasure of having a long discussion with him about his work and what he's done and what he's going to be talking about today. But I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Fateh Azzam, who's the director of the Asfari Institute for Civil Society and Citizenship here at AUB, which is a brand new institute, which maybe he'll mention now in his own introduction. But I just wanted to welcome you all here and welcome John Pace, who, as I say, we're very, very happy to have in part of this inauguration month here at IFI. As you know, on Thursday, I think it is, the official building will be inaugurated. There'll be a whole sort of cake and whatever else is being done here. We've had this whole month a series of talks within the various programs at AUB, including the climate change program. There's a human rights program. There's the UN program, there's an international affairs program, and there's various other programs which I encourage everybody to, it's on the website, and I encourage everybody to take a look at it, a lot of different publications and lectures throughout the year. So, and I also encourage everybody, there's an exhibit as part of this inauguration, there's an exhibit outside for United Nations photos as part of the UNSCO. This is the Lebanese, I forget what the actual special coordinator of the Office for Lebanon. And so all these photos were given to us for them for the next week or two. So I encourage you all to take a look at that on your way out. So I'm going to pass this, Fateh. I think John will talk for about 20 minutes or half hour, and then we'll look forward to having a very good discussion after that. Please.
Thank you, Kareem. Hello, everyone. As Lee said, I'm Director of the Asfari Institute for Civil Society, and I'm here only partially in that capacity, but also as member of the Human Rights Research Project team at Islam Paris Institute. I'm very pleased and very honored to be welcoming John. He's a dear friend, and perhaps, you know, he is an almost unknown soldier of the human rights movement globally and the human rights system in the United Nations. I would even say that, you know, if you don't mind my saying it, he's a walking institutional memory of how human rights has developed in the UN system over the years. John began his career in the UN working on Palestinian rights as early as 1968 in the UN system. And he went on to work at the Human Rights Center long before it became a Human Rights Council, and long before it became the establishment of the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. And I'm happy to welcome the regional representative and Renaud, our former colleagues from that office. John also served as Secretary to the Human Rights Commission. Before that became the Human Rights Council in 2008. He was a coordinator of the 1993 World Conference on Human Rights, which many of you, I'm sure, have known about. So anything wonderful that happened there and anything bad that happened there, you can blame him. And he headed the special procedures and technical cooperation programs at the UN and has led many fact-finding missions for the Commission on Human Rights in several countries. John has also been involved in the Arab region for many years. He was chief of the human rights component of the United Nations mission in Iraq from 2003 to 2006. 2004 to 2006.
After the explosion, after the blast.
Oh, good, okay. And he was also in Lebanon after the war in 2006 with the Office of the Coordinator for Humanitarian Affairs. And he's worked in Palestine a number of times, including with Diakonia, and he's right now still involved in Palestine, helping Al-Haq and the Independent Commission for Human Rights work on the implications of the recent ratification by Palestine of the number of human rights treaties. He currently lives between Malta and Australia, but I think we'll have him much closer to the region from now on in Malta. John is fond of saying that he began his career with the UN at a time when he was young and didn't know any better. And I think now, certainly John knows a lot better, and it'll be very interesting, and we're anxious to hear his thoughts and to learn from his perspectives. Please, John. Sorry I was too long in this introduction.
Thank you very much, Fateh. Thank you very much, Karim. Thank you, everybody, for taking your time to come here and listen to this talking dinosaur. Fateh was quite right in saying that I am a little bit pre-diluvial. Okay. I also talk a lot, so please look at your watches when you start to get bored, and if I don't stop, start shaking your watch and putting it to your ear to pretend that it stopped. I'm not joking, I'm quite serious about that, as my dear wife will say. Please do, I do not know what the form is, but I have no, I think it'll be good if you wish to interrupt me as I am talking to try, just try it. If you succeed, fantastic, and I hope you will, because I prefer that we clear any questions that you may have as we go along. My approach is essentially, my focus is evolutive. In other words, I'm here today to try to make a point with you, to share a point with you, where I believe the Arab region, and Lebanon in particular, I would say, must and should examine closely their interaction with the international human rights system, because both are in great need of clearing up and airing those channels. There is a wealth of experience that has been gained at the international level, and as you all know, the Arab region is extremely rich in human rights experience, bitter as it may be, but nonetheless important, in fact vital, if we are going to have any meaningful further progress in this evolution. So I may sound sometimes negative, but the general thrust of my purpose is upbeat. I do believe, unless of course I am more insane than some people say, that after 45 years in work in human rights, I do believe that there is interesting, concrete, constructive developments. I avoid using words like better or worse. I always say to my students that human rights is not a beauty contest, and we've had that from the beginning. We have had the West blaming the East for things that the East did not do well, the East blaming the West for the other things they didn't do well, and of course that has nothing to do with human rights, because human rights is essentially about people, about dignity, and about something that is so obvious that we don't notice it. And that's the reality of human rights. Now, last year, I was invited by some dear colleagues to participate in a conference in Vienna that was to focus on the 20th anniversary of the Vienna conference, which, as Fateh has said, I had the privilege of coordinating. And at that conference, it became clear to me, I had spent the previous 13 years focused mainly on what the UN world calls field work. I had been in various theaters, if you like. In addition to Lebanon and Iraq, I was in Liberia, I was in Cambodia, I was in Indonesia, I was in a number of other countries, working either as an academic, God help academia. I am a senior visiting fellow at the University of New South Wales in Sydney, and an adjunct in the Sydney Centre for International Law at Sydney University, among other claims to fame. And so I do teach from time to time, and whenever I teach, I try to learn as much as I can from my students. And having done these 13 years and having gone to Vienna, I shared with my colleagues, who were more or less the usual suspects kind of constellation, you know, that I was not happy at all with the way things had gone since Vienna. And it was rather surprising for me to hear myself saying that, because being an eternal optimist, I always crave to make things look really well. And I wrote a paper after that conference. I was invited by the organizers to write a paper, which I believe is somewhere here, somewhere. Yeah, it's a thrilling 30-page document, which I suggest you read in case you have difficulties in sleeping, because it will send you to sleep beautifully. But do persevere, because it is designed, it is very much the context of what we're doing, what we're saying today. That paper speaks of the architecture of the United Nations Human Rights Program. And by that, I meant the Human Rights Council since 2006, as you know, and the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. I addressed the other parts of the architecture, the treaty system, the special procedures, and so on, but I focus on these two because, to me, the way in which these two pillars of this architecture had developed was symptomatic of the concern that I wanted to share then and I want to share now. What I'm doing today, therefore, is taking that concern and applying it to the Arab region. In other words, I say, for instance, that the Human Rights Council has become atrophied because it's made up of 47 member states. Commission at the last format was 53 member states. Numbers are not really very meaningful, but as I say in that paper, Kofi Annan had a choice at that time whether to go for a kind of 47 small council with obvious advantages and some disadvantages, the other option being a council of the whole, all member states in there. And he opted for the first one, and I say in the paper how I feel that that was not really the right decision, but it was an easy one in relative terms. It was faisable. It did not need an amendment to the Charter. And let's face it, the human rights haves, as I call them, as distinct from the rest of us, the human rights have-nots, felt that they could get a ruling majority in the Council, which they didn't. And as a result, this atrophy became embittered, and to make matters worse, civil society was totally excluded, really, I mean relatively totally, but is certainly excluded from participating or contributing anything meaningful to the agenda of the Council. Ironically, and therefore I felt that there was a shortcoming there in the context of Vienna, because Vienna was very much focused on bringing home universality as an applicable criterion, norm. And here I would like to just make a quick flashback before I continue with the Vienna, to explain why Vienna was so keen on universality. The Vienna process, which took 3 years. It took 3 years to organize the Vienna Conference. During those 3 years, and that was my job at that time, a number of historical events occurred. For example, there was the first ever meeting of states in Asia on a human rights agenda. It took place in Bangkok, I think somewhere around January 1993. You don't see it on the record, but the sheer pain just to decide who was Asia. The Americans claimed that they have the Pacific coastline, so they are part of Asia. Canada, the same. Japan, of course, it's in Asia. But they do not belong completely to the Asian group in the UN constellation of states. They are part also, they participate in the Western European group, and so on. So already the choice of the participants was a major painful exercise. And it took a lot of effort and diplomacy in order to try to convince Australia, Canada, the United States, for example, to act as observers. They were not part of the Asian regional meeting. So that particular meeting in Asia brought, not only was it the first in history where Asian governments were actually discussing a human rights agenda, but it coincided with the time where the doctrine of cultural relativism had reached a certain momentum. As you know, cultural relativism, essentially inspired by the then burgeoning emergence of China, already Iran, after the revolution had started to bring this concept forward more and more, meant the distinction between your human rights in the West and our human rights in the East, or our human rights in the South. And it was vital, from any point of view, that there is an international agreement about the fact that human rights were indeed universal values. And it was there that text was developed whereby the Asian meeting proposed to Vienna, and Vienna eventually incorporated it in the final document, the Vienna Declaration and Program of Action. It's in paragraph 5 now, which spells out the formula to accommodate the need to acknowledge the universal nature of human rights, but also to acknowledge the fact that there are clearly certain relative cultural and historical and traditional values that must be taken into account in assessing, for example. In addition, there was a regional meeting of the Latin American and Caribbean states in Costa Rica. There was a meeting of the African states in Tunis in 1992, November. So we had a kind of little circus, you know. As Secretary of the Commission on Human Rights, I had a group of about 9 to 10 colleagues, and together we served as the Commission. So when the order came in for the World Conference, we used this little circus to organize the bigger one. And of course, not to tell you, I mean, Vienna itself had about 15,000 participants. It had about 1,300 correspondents accredited in the conference center, all asking for news. God help them, you know, human rights. We had 841 NGOs from all over. So all this had to be kind of marshaled towards this substantive energy of universality. It wasn't just a show. If people participated in Bangkok or in San Jose or in Tunis, it was for a purpose. And indeed, in parallel to those meetings, there were huge NGO fora. And therefore, there was an input from the civil society into the work of the governments in each and every one of these meetings, and then add to that over 200 or 300 activities that took place during that period in various shapes: meetings, books, seminars, art exhibitions, and so on. And not to mention the demonstrations, the bitterness that sometimes it engendered. It was a bittersweet experience. And so it was truly a step, an evolutive step of the international human rights agenda towards an affirmation of the true universality of human rights. And so, as a result, after that, you had a series of activities by the Secretary General in order to make sure that this universality is indeed implemented within the bureaucracy, within the UN system, and indeed with regard to the civil society and with regard to people. On the wall, there is a sketch, an organogram, which was proposed in 1997 by Kofi Annan. It is page 30 of a 95-page report. Nothing is simple in the UN, as you know. But that one is illustrative because it places human rights. You can't see it very clearly from here. But what Kofi Annan did was to group the United Nations world into 4 areas: And as a common denominator to each of the 4 areas, there would be human rights. So human rights was the only program that kind of cut across the entire family. So you had one group on peace and security, that's the upper left-hand one group on economic and social affairs, upper right-hand one, humanitarian affairs, lower left, and development on the lower right. And as you see there in the boxes are the components of the bureaucracy that should compose that group. So you have, for example, under the development group, you have UNDP, UNICEF, and UNFPA, for example. And then on humanitarian, you have UNRWA, UNHCR, WPF, and so on. So, and human rights, now the question arose how to make human rights from that line there at the bottom to feed into. And a number of activities took place. There was another report after that to try to further push this. A lot of money spent on the so-called Action 2. And so when I was on the field, I started to look for human rights as being, I was a mercenary, you know. In some areas I was a human rights person, sometimes I was humanitarian, sometimes I was a constitutional, God help me, expert, sometimes I was, you know, I was various hats. But I was always part of a country team of sorts. And I could not see human rights, or if I saw it, it was alongside the service providers, like water and sanitation, or tents, or whatever, food, which is fine, because there are activities of human rights that are peculiar to human rights, like issues dealing with administration of justice, police training, prison, and so on. But there was not the universal injection of human rights in the culture of the colleagues. And I point this out very clearly because I then started to try to find out why. And one of the reasons why, essentially, is because with the elitist formation of the Human Rights Council and the exclusion of civil society, with the kind of predominance of the search for funding by the various development actors, human rights began to be considered as a nuisance, as a competitor for funding, a competitor for turf, which of course may have been partly right, but even if it were right, it would have been correct, but mainly because human rights was not being seen as sitting next to the resident coordinator, the head of the UN in a country, or the head of the mission in the country to that extent. A notable exception was my experience 2 years in Iraq, where I, as head of the Human Rights Office, had the benefit of an SRSG, the representative of the Secretary General, Ashraf Ghazi, who was, to my mind, a fantastic person to work with in human rights terms, because he made sure I was with him in every one of the political meetings he had with the various parts of the Iraqi hierarchy, with the military, and also with the rest of the system. So that is what would be the appropriate injection of human rights as a universal norm within the system. And quite frankly, in those 13 years, apart from that exception, it didn't take place. As a reflection of that, because of the dramatic evolution of the work, the Office of the High Commissioner, which I had the honor of serving for 33 years, from 1966 to 1999, probably to celebrate my departure, grew all of a sudden because of this evolution that took place. And there was a dramatic increase in budget, a dramatic increase. In other words, the will to include human rights in the program was manifested by Kofi Annan in the support that he gave human rights, dramatic support, to make it stronger administratively. But the program became even more complex, and therefore there was an issue of quality, of manpower, and of management, which always happens in any bureaucracy anyway, but in this case it stood out quite bluntly. The High Commissioner for Human Rights, as you know, in her mandate, his mandate, is meant to be the senior official of the United Nations in all matters dealing with human rights in the system. And in reality, it isn't anymore. Not because of the High Commissioner, again because of this cultural paralysis, if you like, of accepting the idea that the system should work on a human rights basis. So now where do we stand in Beirut? Well, I mentioned that the Council, ironically, the Council is not universal, but it has a universal periodic review mechanism, which is universal because all of them are recommending things to each other. But there is no input from civil society. The input from civil society, apart from the token 1 or 2 speakers that managed to get to say something for 30 seconds when the report of the working group is already finished, consists of a huge list of so-called shadow reports, which are summarized into 10 pages by my colleagues in the Secretariat, God bless them, may God give them peace and long life, because they have the task of summarizing into 10 pages the impossible task. If you look at the website, and I challenge some, not all, because I know some of you will know it, to try to find them, because they are put on the website. But, my goodness, it's easier to dig the remains of Baalbek than to find the statements of the NGOs in the human rights so-called Universal Periodic Review. It's a good thing. I'm not saying it's bad. What is not right is that the Council is not universal. And we need to make the Council universal. How do we do it? Well, the Arab region, my goodness, how rich is it, as we said? We spoke, I would like to acknowledge the excellent paper produced by Fateh recently on the Arab region and the United Nations procedures. I find it really very instructive and extremely useful. A first of its kind, if I may say. And we need to marshal this wealth of human rights experience in the region in order to influence the agenda of the Council. I do not mean just sending shadow reports, because they've been sent, but I mean literally influencing the agenda, making sure that the Council does take up these issues, not because they belong to the Middle East or they belong to the Central African region or whatever, but because they are human rights issues. And of course they address the Middle East, and of course they address Central Africa. But the criterion is human rights or not. And therefore, I believe very, very much that in Lebanon, for example, you have a very good umbrella group of NGOs, and God knows you can discuss, you people. I thought the Maltese can discuss, and the Italians. Forget it. Come to Lebanon. And I appreciate it, really. Especially when you're behind the wheel asking the red-plated taxi driver, which way am I going? And he says, go right. Okay. Never mind. Now I know that this is straight, right? Not this. So we need to engage. We need to, you have here a fantastic office, one former and one actual head of office here. They have, I'm sure, I didn't talk to them, but I'm sure they have a big problem to communicate the substance with Geneva and to make it relevant to the work of Geneva. And Geneva needs to come back and feed on this experience here in order to be able to make it relevant. As Fateh said, the week after next I'm back in Ramallah organizing a 5-day seminar for various participants on the implications of the accessions of Palestine to the treaties. So it's stretchy. I was involved in the whole question of statehood 3 or 4 years ago, and don't be carried away. I'm nobody. I'm just, I try to assist where I can. But I have the privilege of, again, a few of these white hairs, or gray, silver gray, and I need to share it with you. So therefore, I believe that there are several things we can do. In the first place, the structures are there. The structures are there. The experience is there. But we need to open the pipelines. We need to de-block the pipeline. And that's not easy because there is blockage, especially at the Geneva end. They are doing their best, but as we said, they're having their hands full trying to explain to the rest of the system that they should be cutting across the system. But in the same time, they need to be able to do that much more enriched by the experience, by the input from the regions. Because otherwise, the message that the High Commissioner's Office gives to the rest of the system is essentially almost banalized. Ah, yes, we know human rights. I can tell you something, and I'm sure you will not be surprised. There is a rumor going around, and it's not me who's saying it, that in the recently failed talks on Syria, for example, the idea was that human rights doesn't go anywhere near those talks. And you know, there were commissions of inquiry. There were very cogent, clear human rights reports. There was a lot of activity, and they take it for that. And one would have thought that any kind of peace talk, any negotiation on an agreement would at least somehow, if not at the top of the agenda, but quite close to the agenda, take it from a human rights perspective. It wasn't, obviously, and it didn't happen. And so long as we don't address human rights issues across the board, in this way, we are simply going. So the message is this: we need to be able to encourage the central authority in Geneva, for example, to decentralize without losing the homogeneous nature of the message. We all agree that human rights are universal, but human rights to be universal has to be closer to its components. I would, for example, love to see the Human Rights Council meeting here in Beirut. In fact, I'd like to see them taking a drive up the road. I tell you, that would teach them a lesson. But what I mean is, why not? Why not in Bangkok? Why not in Addis Ababa? Why not in Santiago, where the UN has already regional facilities? It is part of the real life, material manifestation of universality. Decentralization while keeping homogeneous the value of human rights. And that's, I think I've done my 30 minutes. Have I? I can.
You have 5 more minutes.
I have 5 more minutes. You realize this is very dangerous. I thought you were going to do this, no? Now, okay. All these years that I have been involved in this subject, if you like, I think in hindsight, one of the aspects that kept me, if you like, engaged, which I am, is the lesson I was taught by my colleagues in the Secretariat when I started in 1966. Don't forget that in 1966, January, when I started, there was no international human rights law, punto. There was only the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the Genocide Convention. I was recruited, now I really get into dinosaur area, there was a photo exhibition somewhere here. I was recruited by John Humphrey, who was Secretary of the Commission on Human Rights, with Eleanor Roosevelt. Imagine how old he was. Roosevelt, المرأة مش الرجال. So, however, during those years, I have had the privilege of riding this huge wave that started, ironically, with the Six-Day War in '67. And the reason that Fateh said why I started working on Palestine is because I was leaving the UN. I couldn't stand it anymore. And my director then suggested to me that if I stay, he would give me the Palestine dossier. The covenants were only adopted by the Assembly, as you know, later that year. And it took 11 years to find the ratifications for the 35 states, for them to come into force. So we should not be shocked at the fact that we are still conceptually so behind. We are not behind. As I said to a dear friend the other day, it's only 2014, you know. So, and that's the spirit in which we should take it. But we need to move, and I believe that that means taking action. Not necessarily, and not only physical, why not? I'm never against the demonstration, but intellectual, spiritual, in substance. Making sure that the concerns that we have are addressed by, and if they're not addressed by the Council, then we have to make sure that they are, one way or another, not to give up. Because the Council needs us, even though they don't think so. The Council needs us. The way they are going, for all intents and purposes, they can pack up. But if we make sure that they are not afraid of us, that they are able to use our experience to their benefit as a Human Rights Council, then I believe we would be helping everybody. And that's what I would like to have identified now. Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity of talking to you. I am amazed at myself for stopping. It hurts. But I am hoping that you will ask a lot of nasty questions so that Fatah can answer them. Thank you.
If I could just say one thing, I wanted just to make sure also to thank Samar Hanum and the other people at IFI to help organize this, which I forgot to mention at the beginning of my the introduction, so please go ahead.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much, John. As usual, thought-provoking and making us think about how one can go about doing that. How can, we often talk about human rights as speaking truth to power, and usually meaning, you know, the power that controls life, being governments. But here John is talking about civil society, academics, ourselves here, speaking truth to the UN system itself, to the system that collects those states and tries to find that balance between a moral motivation of how to move forward with the international community and the existing system of sovereign states that operate primarily on the basis of their own material, strategic, military, financial interest. And it's that balance that human rights attacks head-on, because it does represent the international community's desire to be more moral, if you will, by articulating those treaties, by getting states to sign them, but still not quite willing to give it teeth, not quite willing to give it enforcement mechanisms. And you know, you might take that as a question if you like to elaborate on further, but with that, I will open the floor and please, go ahead.
Yes, sir.
My question is about cultural relativism. Universality of human rights, certainly we do not question. Well, you refer to the 1993 Vienna Convention. That was certainly crucial, very important. How you see, I mean, or how you approach the Cairo Declaration of Human Rights. A number of Arab states, for example, say that, well, we have also a declaration, and therefore this does not contradict the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. However, when we read the declaration, I mean, although it seems, I mean, similar in many aspects, and when we compare the articles, we find similarities, but still this cultural relativism persists, and probably you would like to comment on this issue.
So
please.
Would you like to take a few, and then
maybe. Thank you very much. I will.
Okay. Another question or comment? Salam?
Okay, thank you. Thank you, John, for the...
Can you raise your voice?
Yes, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Salam Sid Ahmed. I'm Fatah's successor, actually, regional representative for the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. I just would like to maybe pick on a point of the UN human rights mechanisms. There was I think there was hope that the mechanisms being based on a kind of normative values or approach may override the usual political composition of the member states as intergovernmental bodies, and then bring something that is different from what normally UN does in be it in passing resolutions or trying to follow up on imposing human rights values. However, the feeling is that throughout the life of the Human Rights Commission, the reverse happened, is that the political composition took over, the normative approach. Now, I don't know whether you see a bit of a difference in the Human Rights Council approach, particularly with the injection of the Universal Periodic Review at the
Thank you. Maybe you should take those two first.
Yeah, please.
They're quite good. Thank you very much. Who invited you? That's good, I appreciate that. Cultural relativism will exist. If it doesn't exist, we're in trouble. Because in human rights, one of the most persistent dilemmas that exist is trying to divorce human rights in standards, if you like, in the UN sense, from religion, for example. Or now, ironically, as you know, the elaboration of treaties, and in particular the Universal Declaration, is a reverse process. It was a kind of down-up process. It was a distillation of standards who were, coming together. And over the years, when I started, for example, we had a program of so-called advisory services, which had been founded in the mid-50s, by which various ideas that were being exchanged in regard to the would-be covenants were discussed at various regions with various groups, academics, NGOs, religious groups, and so on. So in spite of that process, of course, certain trends, regional cultural trends, remain strong, and there's a constant confusion, if you like, in terms of the place of international human rights standards as stipulated in the new human rights era of the UN and traditional values. If you look at CEDAW, for example, the Treaty on Discrimination Against Women, you will see that there's a constant ongoing kind of polite or semi-polite exchange between the committee and various member states about issues relating to the status of women, like inheritance or like name, or like travel, or things like that, things that are sort of Sharia-based, if you like, or religion-based. But that's not the only sector that has such issues. They shouldn't be there, and it will take some time before the, if you like, the culture settles in that you can have your religious beliefs and your human rights standards living next to each other. Don't forget that human rights, as you rightly indicated, went through a very traumatic evolution from the first phase in the late 40s, early 50s. As you know, the Universal Declaration is one instrument, but the covenants are two. And the divorce took place in 1951, and since that time, what with the Declaration on Development in '86 and so on, there have been various attempts at stating the obvious, which is that human rights, Vienna, that human rights is one. You can't divide it. So there is indeed an issue of coexistence between cultural values and international, if not universal, values, and that will remain. What will probably determine the future, I think, is the degree with which there is a consensus on the essential values that they are supposed to apply. So I don't think we should waste too much energy on characterizing sort of the shade of thought, you know. Like, remember during the big Cold War, where you were either totalitarian or communist, whatever, or, God help us, capitalist. Look what happened. One collapsed and the other one took over. What a mess. So we need to look at these values from the practical side, but we should not try to waste too much energy on trying to eradicate, because it won't happen. Human rights is not a law subject. Human rights is an anthropological subject. It's about human behavior. And that includes, we should be ready to consider and take into account human cultural values in applying the universal standards. It's a bit of a Maltese reply that I gave you, but it is a real one, you know, as far as I see. As far as the Council is concerned, if I may, the Salam, I was 16 years Secretary of the Commission. And in addition to that, I was the head of the special procedures for the first 10 years of their existence. So we were evolving procedures that now are taken for granted. Special rapporteurs, special representatives, working groups. When we were developing this, my team and myself, of course, under the guidance of the Commission and the Assembly, because, for example, the rules of procedure of the Committee on Israeli Practices in the occupied territories had to be adopted by the Assembly because it was an Assembly body. We had to work within these political parameters, and we still do. I don't think that the political connotation or context of human rights is going to be avoided. It cannot be. Like cultural relativism, it's where we are. And that is where the measure of the relevance or not of the Council or the Commission can be measured. I am worried about the Council, not only because of the numbers. I'm worried about it because of the culture of exclusion or elitism. Anecdotally, you would probably not be surprised to remember that, you know, now you can watch on the web, on webcast live, the UPR, for example, the Council. Well, when that was proposed, the Council didn't want it. They felt that it was nobody else's business. It was a kind of, there is a culture of kind of exclusivity, if you like, and that's wrong. And that's why I insist on the relevance of the theme of today, that the Arab region has an obligation, a duty, and in fact has a claim to fame to make sure that the concerns, human rights concerns prevailing in the Arab region, and my God, are they ever in this era especially, should be seriously examined, pursued, followed up. Step one forward, two back maybe, but certainly should be on the agenda, not just in the content, but in the actual participation of the actual physical interaction of what is concerned. So cultural relativism, I think we need to subsume it in that way. And the political context will become stronger and dangerous if it isn't. Look at the agenda of the Council today. They discuss whether they should discuss Palestine. Now, if you tell me, if you have any human rights problem in the world today, in the last 60 years, apartheid being, relatively speaking, a thing of the past, because that was the other big one. What other flagrant human rights violation do you have? Where you have, technically speaking, the acquisition of territory by force, without going into religions and details and so on. That is a no-no, like torture is a no-no, erga omnes, and so on and so forth. So, and the Council discusses whether it should discuss it, instead of having it number one on its agenda and doing something practical about it. And the reason for that is not only because of the protective reaction of states to try to be exclusive, but because of the desertification, the drying up of the civil society input. And as I said in our preliminary discussions with Karim, I talk about civil society, I talk about the NGO human rights community, I talk about business, I talk about academia, I talk about any institution that is simply not government. Because with this crystallization of the Council, as you will see if you go a little bit closer, When you talk of governments in relation to the Council, you're actually talking about the delegation present in Geneva. You're not talking about the real politicians, if you like, and the real leaders in the capitals. And that's fine. They are usually very capable diplomats. They can formulate terrific things. They can make things that don't smell good smell like roses. But in reality, the bad smell is still existing in the country. And therefore, that's what we need to understand. We cannot eliminate it. Why should we? It's history and it's culture, if you like. But we need to enrich it. And we have an obligation to enrich it.
John, if I may follow up on the cultural relativism question, wouldn't you agree that, in fact, the human rights system, if you will, when you look at each of the conventions and treaties, that the idea of cultural balances or relativism is already built into it? And I mentioned a couple of examples. One being, that oftentimes, very few of the rights are really absolute rights, like prevention of torture, or the right to life is not absolute, right? But most rights are in fact balanced by the need to regard public order, public morality, and various other balances that each society will have to find for itself. So I often make the point, and I don't know, I'm asking if you agree that I would be right in doing that or not, because if I'm wrong, then a lot of students have gotten the wrong end of the stick here. I've often made the point that, in fact, cultural relativism has already been taken into account. If each society can interpret public morality in its own fashion within the legal system of rights, that the cultural perspectives are taken into account. Another, example of that is the fact that states can make reservations on certain provisions, as many have done on the Convention for the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, for example. States make reservations on issues like inheritance and women giving nationality to children, things like that. Now, it remains then a matter for civil society within each of those societies to be fighting for continuous change, to be fighting for withdrawing those reservations, for a higher level of standard of protection. So in that sense, the system is already built in. And I think one other evidence, and I'll stop here, is the fact that the discussion since the adoption of the Cairo Declaration on Human Rights in Islam and other attempts in the past have become pretty much dead letters now. Nobody uses the Cairo Declaration. It came out, they made a point, established this declaration, and then nobody does anything about it. In fact, they are very engaged in the international human rights system. They have signed on to most of the treaties, as I've mentioned in the study. They do the reports, they defend themselves, they defend the records, and they're engaged in the international paradigm, not in the regional one.
Okay. Can I address that now, or you have a point?
Yes.
Yes, please.
Yes. Thank you so much. My name is Amar Dirochi. I'm an anthropologist, and I'm also the PI for the Human Rights Project for the Arab world. I'm fascinated by a statement you said that human rights is an anthropological question. It's not necessarily a universal one in that kind of absolute sense. And I'm also was fascinated by your use of the notion of cultural relativism in different ways. And I, of course, from reading a lot about this idea in human rights, it sounds like, I have a lot of problems with this idea that everything that is different becomes kind of put in this vessel of cultural relativism. It seems to me like there are other more important questions like history, historical colonialism, power, that are not really taken into account in thinking about these the development of these ideas. So if I'm every time someone who doesn't really fit my Western universal ideas, then I put them in a cultural category, it seems to be very problematic kind of way. And this is, as a field, as an anthropology, went through this in the 70s and went beyond that. The idea of culturalism, cultural relativism was kind of almost overcame, but it seems like a lot of the human rights language is still stuck in an era where, you know, anything that we don't really kind of is not really Western or not white or anything like that becomes a culturally relative problem. So I'm wondering why this historical notion that, you know, specifically with the effects of colonialism on many of the states, a lot of the laws that now we see as really breaking human rights were institutionalized by colonial institutions in many parts, let's say, in the Arab world. So I'm wondering how one addresses this in an idea of a human rights system that seems to be very synchronically oriented rather than diachronically oriented.
Okay, I agree. I love hearing what you said, honestly, because I don't hear it enough. Why did I call it an anthropological subject? Because even law is an anthropological subject, if you like. Because, as I said, human rights is about human behavior. And it's about human behavior with regard to the relationship with other individuals, society, and so on. There is a corner of it which is legal, because once these modus vivendi, as you know, have crystallized, then somehow we make laws, and then the trouble starts, because we have to have lawyers, for example, and that's even worse, you know, and then judges, God help us. So, the basic concept behind human rights is human behavior, and it is in that context that I call it anthropological subject, and I would like to insist on that. Now, cultural relativism to me is a plus, because the problem is that the term cultural relativism, like so many other terms in the UN system and in human rights in particular, gets stamped with a stigma. It is enriching. Cultural relativism is enriching. What is not enriching is trying to hide behind your finger to justify something that's wrong, and using it because you're different, which is not cultural relativism. It is simply a cultural hijacking, if you like. So, so what's the if you like, the answer? Of course, to me, I have always been very keen to keep my feet on the ground and my hands dirty, is the reality, to try to discover the reality as accurately as you can, as honestly as you can, because it is that reality that will dictate to you what it is that you can do, if anything, about it, and if not, how you can address it. For example, these days we are living in we have a disease prevailing over the globe. It's called asylum seekers. It is people who are taking boats, walking across continents, taking buses, trying to go over fences and so on. And the international system is still applying a convention done in 1951 to try to manage these problems. A convention, the Refugee Convention, simply applies to a small slice of this basket of people who are generally the product of misery, of poverty. We say, oh, conflict. Anyway, we branded conflict. Sorry, not us. We branded economic migrant. Sorry, not us. But of course it's us. Of course it's us. And there are the standards there. So, again, why do we allow this malaise to develop? Why do we only apply a tool that was only developed to guide or to control the flow of refugees from the East Europe to the West Europe? And now we're applying it together with IDPs and so on to the entire planet. It doesn't work. It creates more problems, if anything. Uses huge resources. Fine, at least they are doing something, and my respect to my colleagues at UNHCR, I've always admired them and will continue to do so. But I'm talking about the international institutions, I'm talking about the international community. And therefore, there is a need. It is not conceivable that the Human Rights Council is actually discussing so many other things and not trying to face up to this reality. There's a commission done by Kofi Annan some years ago. You know, in case of doubt, have a committee. But the issue is getting worse. and more diversified, they're more problematic. And now some of it is spreading into migrant worker issues, domestic worker issues. It's going everywhere, you know. The Migrant Worker Convention in the UN hierarchy of conventions, one of the poorest ones, one of the most difficult, if you like, to give any meaningful application to. Took ages to draw. Why? Because some countries, mainly Western powerful, did not want that to happen. Especially because they were discussing, they were to protect migrant workers and their families. And today, what happens is we get this everywhere. I am from Malta, I get people drowning outside the waters or inside. I'm from Australia, I get them being beaten up in Manus or in I was in Nauru. I went for Amnesty International to the island of Nauru when the Tampa refugees were taken there. And I can tell you, at that time, compared to now, it's deluxe. And what I saw and what I lived with, 1,129 people who had did nothing wrong to anybody, including about nearly just under 200 children, unaccompanied, under the age of 13, living like goats in an island that is 15 minutes to drive around. That's all it takes. And then there's nothing. It takes 4.5 hours by plane to go from Brisbane to get there. 4.5 hours, you're in London from here. Why? Because there is, the international system has not come around to addressing the situation. And then, therefore, why doesn't the Council take it up? Because civil society is not moving. So I believe that unless and until civil society moves, governments are not going to do it. It's historic. You mentioned the human rights and the Charter. Don't forget, human rights were included in the Charter as an afterthought. It was an amendment in 1945 to the draft Charter that gave us the provisions of the human rights and the Charter that we have today. So unless governments are put under, sorry, I get excited, you know. Unless governments are put under, well, pressure, yes, benevolent if you like, but pressure there must be. We are a little bit sort of we're cruising too much now. We're too cool. We need to get going. We need to go back to the time when, you know, it was a little bit more tough, perhaps, because it is tough. Right, Zaina.
Thank you for a very interesting talk. In addition to the point that Mr. Abdeslam raised about the UN human rights mechanism, I think there is the human rights-based approach that is really key in terms of applying practically the values of human rights into practice and bring more social justice through spreading the culture of human rights. Actually, I had the occasion to try to spread human rights principles in Amal Association in practice, and I saw how only by increasing the knowledge on the community level, how the people feel that it's a weapon in their hand to try to acquire their rights and fight for it. So I think there is a long way for us to move forward. And I would like to ask about how we can use this human rights-based approach in civil society, in Lebanon being or in the MENA region, to try to move these principles ahead and spread them, even if the governments are too tight into political constraints, to try to move forward this culture of human rights that could ensure more social justice and advancing human rights principles in terms of policy making also.
Yes, thank you. Yes, can you take a
Sarah.
Sarah, go ahead.
My name is Sarah Ahmed. I'm a Yemeni sociologist, and actually this discussion about universality versus the culture is interesting for me. And what you last said about how civil society should move in order for the governments to be under pressure reminds me of a very recent example in Yemen. In March 2012, the UN took the lead for the National Dialogue Conference to take place in Yemen. From my perspective, what the UN did and for the whole year of 2011 and the aftermath of 2011 and the uprisings is that they spent a lot of money on training civil society in order to head towards the National Dialogue Conference. And the main goal for Jamal and Omar back then was stability, no more or less. there was a report that had 20 points and was presented to Jamal bin Omar. In this report, Omar was told that the National Dialogue Conference cannot be held with feasible results if these 20 points are not implemented. And Omar refused to listen, and he also alienated the civil society actors who would not agree to participate in the National Dialogue Conference. Sometimes it's not the culture clashing with the UN. Sometimes the culture is begging the UN to come and listen, and there are no contradictions. Sometimes the culture is begging the UN to stand for its own principles, but they are too busy with stability rather than listening to actors on the ground. Now the National Dialogue Conference is over with $7 billion spent on it, and the war they delayed is happening right now. So I'm just wondering, what are the standards that would make a UN envoy listen to civil society that does not match to the agenda and the deadlines and the checklist?
Yeah, can I just quickly note to that? Just one, but then I'll come back. Definitely, I had the same problem after Ashraf left in Iraq, and there is a need to cultivate, to educate, if you like, the UN leadership in these contexts. There's not a sufficient human rights paradigm or content in their culture, in their work. That was basically my point today, and we need to move that. Anyway, I'll come back to this, but I couldn't resist saying this. Sorry.
It's okay. Excuse me, because I'm losing my voice a bit, so I'll do the best I can. My question is related to both of theirs, actually. I'm the head of the resident coordinator's office here in Lebanon, and also advisor for coordination to the special coordinator. There's a lot of coordination for Lebanon. One thing after sort of 13 years in the field, I learned after going back to business school and studying organizational change, because I was really keen on looking at how we can take Kofi Annan's agenda for change and really push some things forward in a practical way. Two important lessons came out of that. One, culture is the most difficult thing to change in an organization, and two, that change and innovation happens most effectively at the field level, decentralized. Here in Lebanon, like other places where I've worked, I find this transition from principles into practice where, always where it's the most difficult, and that lack of teeth, that sort of enforcement mechanisms that you mentioned are really straddling us, and I think in many ways threaten the integrity of the UN's lead in this process. From the UNCT side, this human rights-based approach in programming is a great idea, and when we implement it well, it can show really effective results. But from a collective experience in a particular country, looking at the UN's impact, it's quite disappointing how that tool is being wielded for its intended purpose. When there's a political mission or a peacekeeping mission, in this country we've got both, human rights and sort of the softer side of things that the UN is doing, the soft side, is often subsumed by a peace and security agenda and political considerations, and that's as true here as it was in Iraq, where I also worked, and many other places. So I guess the question is a practical one. What do you see are some specific things that we could do based on your experience to try to manage some of these contradictions, these inherent difficulties? In civil society, we keep coming back to that. We still are really terrible at engaging it in a meaningful and consistent way, building that into our processes and our planning. Thank you.
Thank you. Sure, please, no. There's a bit there. Go ahead.
Coraline, teaching here as assistant professor in political studies. There are so many questions I'd like to raise, but I have to limit myself to a couple. Yeah, so one, I was thinking, you worked in Iraq. I was thinking back in the 1990s, if I'm not mistaken, the primary UN office dealing with human rights in the 1990s in Iraq was focusing on violations of human rights committed by the Iraqi regime, and not questioning the impact of the UN Security Council sanctions on Iraq. So this question related to the politicization of the human rights agenda is, maybe how much room do you think there is within UN agencies to discuss the impact on human rights of UN actions and policies, notably UN Security Council actions? So that would be one question. Another one, struggling to put this into words, but you cautioned at the beginning of your talk about talking about whether things are getting better or worse, and that human rights it's not a beauty contest. And you suggested as well that when lawyers, judges get involved, then we're already in trouble, or things maybe not necessarily moving forward. And there seems to be a consensus on the fact that culture is very important. You stress the role that should be played by us. So primarily civil society, academia, journalists. Now, I'm wondering, according to your experience, do you believe that so first of all, what is the role left for the UN and this formidable structure in the human rights field? What role is left for the UN to play if we're back highlighting what civil society, etc., other people can do, try to exert pressure, not solely on governments, but also on the UN? And then, the second related question, and I'll stop there. Do you believe that improvement, evolution in human rights is dependent upon some kind of enforcement capacity? This has been raised a couple of times. And if yes, in what sense? What kind of enforcement capacity from?
Right.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Please.
Yes, yes.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm currently carrying out a whole history project of the experiences, border control experiences of Palestinians fleeing Syria to Lebanon. And I have a simple question for you. Okay, sorry. I have a simple question for you. How can you so firmly believe in the universality of human rights when, at the end of the day, local practices has the final word, that being here or in Scandinavia or in Switzerland, for example, with the measures of deportation methods, which in some cases in Europe have killed people who have been deported to or were going to be deported to the places they fled from. I have a problem with understanding how universality can be the ideal when subjectivity is actually what's violated. And I don't know if you've read Laurie Allen's very good book from last year on the rise and fall of human rights in Palestine, where she suggests kind of a deconstruction of the entire discourse of human rights. Thanks.
Thank you. Okay. Well, let me just quickly, now, if I don't address any of the points raised, you make sure that I do by pointing it out, okay? Because I need to. I think Zaina mentioned her work and the work of Amel, and I think that it needs to be pointed out. If you want a kind of prototype, non-governmental activity that is serving the purpose of human rights in the real sense, you should look at the work and methodology followed by this organization. I have been familiar with it in the past, and I've tried to carry the model with me elsewhere because it basically gives priority to people, regardless of their religion, their culture, and so on. But certainly the focal point is need, addressing need. Now, I would say that in this case, don't forget that the human rights-based approach to development was actually coined in the context of this transition integrated in that thing on the wall, where the attempt was started to integrate human rights into the rest of the system. And I remember sitting with a colleague from UNDP, a Swedish chap by the name of Palmlund, and we signed the very first ever project between UNDP and Human Rights. It was called HURIST, Human Rights Strengthening. And it went on for quite a few years after I left. And it wasn't easy to implement that because human rights is kind of one kind of bird, animal, if you like, and development is another. I'll give you an example. During the early years of special procedures, when I was between 78 and 88, I was responsible for them. And we used to escort rapporteurs to various countries to fact find, not to investigate, but to fact find. UNDP used to close its door, send the driver to the airport, and the resident representative would run to the hills to pretend either he's got pneumonia, or he's got his wife that is sick, or I can give you a collection of wonderful excuses, but my colleagues, brothers and sisters in UNDP were never near. Perhaps that's quite all right because it made us a little bit tough, so much so that we were actually autonomous. When we traveled, we had a kind of one of each, like a Noah's Ark. And we were able to be autonomous, to hear people within 2 hours of arrival anywhere. We had batteries to work our recorders. We had a parliamentary reporter. We were totally self-sufficient. We did not need, we had to survive. So we had 20 cases. You know? We were just like Barnum and Bailey's arriving in town. It was very difficult to integrate human rights, and still is, into the system. At least now, our colleagues, our resident coordinators, our res reps, and so on, and also the agencies, WHO, UNICEF has always been a friend, I suppose, ever since we gave them the convention, which took 18 years. The Child Convention took 18 years to bring about, don't forget. It wasn't a picnic. It's a delight to work with. But I was in Nepal for 5 years, going in and out of 5 years, working on their national commission, and I worked with the resident coordinator there. They're a delight to work with. But he's the first to admit the need to have. So in answer to the question, for instance, I would say that rather than trying to include human rights, serious human rights in their qualifications, my feeling is to have a good seasoned, like me, for example, like him, a good seasoned human rights person next door to the resident coordinator, because it is much easier than writing memoranda and sending emails. It's simply, you know, like, Fateh, what the hell shall we do with this? And do this or do that, you know? I think that's by far the easiest and the most kind of user-friendly way of integrating human rights into that kind of system. So HRBA was developed after we signed this agreement in order to explain that development, health, housing, and so on, education, would be approached as before, but bearing in mind human rights standards. That is the human rights-based approach to development. Now, like so many other things, we have the cliche, HRBA, stamp it, and then we forget about it. R2P is another beautiful one. Responsibility to protect, is it? Okay, well, there you go. It's not right to protect, it's responsibility to protect. We put R2P, stamp it, halas. So we can forget about it. It's a cliche. We need to make sure that we constantly understand and appreciate and act on the full knowledge and implications of these things. On the point of Yemen, for example, and the transition process, if you can call it that, I'm not sure what it's transiting to, but there you go. And 7 billion is a hell of a lot of money. And there again, I would have thought that, because there were a number of reports done by the High Commissioner, if I remember right, along the line. There was some kind of either investigation mission or special mission. There was some kind of special reports done by the High Commissioner on Yemen.
Several reports to the council.
Yeah, to the council, yeah. Again, like somebody mentioned Iraq before, you know, the commission stuff remains in the commission, if at all, or the council, if at all. Hardly ever goes anywhere else. And that's where the problem is. That's where we need to ensure this fusion. The rapporteur on Iraq from 1991 to 2004 was reporting on violations of human rights. Nothing about the effect of the sanctions. Wrong. But let me tell you, you should know, and I am sure you do, that human rights did not enter the doors of the Security Council until 1994, with the exception of one or two little noises in the 60s after the occupation, when the council sent a mission to, about the annexation of Jerusalem and so on, and the settlements, one-time exercises, nothing, human rights could not even set foot in the council. We had to go through our colleagues it was the Rwanda rapporteur who broke that, not even Yugoslavia, which had taken place 2 years before. And therefore it is not right, and it is not, but it's unfortunately difficult to understand why there is this duplicity, blatant duplicity of work by human rights area and the Security Council. Today, there are a few kind of, the verbiage, the blah blah, is a little better, more eloquent, but we're still not there. The culture is still not there. I mentioned the rumors about Syria. I can mention others, you know. Unfortunately, the culture of the system, because the governments are not interested sometimes. They think it is a hostile thing. They are resisting all the time. They don't want, very few of them hide behind sovereignty anymore. China did it at the beginning, but now even they gave up. So it's not sovereignty, it is essentially a kind of security of sorts. Take an example, very ephemeral, the whole question of women and peace and security. Security Council adopts a resolution, several resolutions, on the role of the need to involve women in peace and security as negotiators, as mediators, and post-conflict, and so on. Since 2000 has been going on, and next year we're going to have a big meeting to review. What to review? No country in this region has even, there was a one passing reference by CEDAW in the 2006 because of the aftermath of 2006 about this role of women in peace and security, or one or two other countries in the other region. Very, very kind of lip service, you know. But we are 14 years. And 42 countries have done national plans on how to integrate women in peace and security only. And they are all the usual suspects. Norway, imagine the conflict of Norway, you know, they've got huge problems of conflict. How much to sell the oil for? That's a big problem, you know. And I hope the cameras, but
Palestine did. Palestine did.
Yeah, Palestine did, rightly so. And we will encourage that. But you see what I mean? Security Council has come a long way in a short time. That's why I keep on saying, I'm not joking when I say to you it's only 2014. Because in the UN calendar, that's just after the Ice Age, I would say. You know, human rights terms. We are really still farther behind than we think. Now, what else did I have to say? Yeah, the civil society and human rights are an integral part of the United Nations, whether they like it or not. It has always been like that. Recently, they've been pushed out of the center stage, but they need to come back. The UN is there precisely as a system to enable government policies, government practices to inform themselves to the extent possible of the reality on the ground as reflected in their own experience, because they are the governments, but in the experience of the rest of the society, which is the civil society. And they are an integral component of the UN system, especially in regard to human rights. Enforcement capacity. The UN is not really about enforcement. Chapter 7, à la rigueur, you know, but even then, look what happened with the sanctions and stuff. Threat to international peace and security. Well, that was true maybe in 1950s, 1940s, if at all, but not in 2014. The real work of the system, international system, is in addressing the causes, in being able to attack quickly, early. And that's why the asylum seeker phenomenon, the people flows phenomenon, is a worrying phenomenon, because it means that the system has neglected it, and it's bad, it's really bad. And it's everywhere. It's Mexico to the United States, it's the poor people from Central Africa crossing the bus and breaking down in the desert, 92 or how many of them dead because of starvation and whatever, 500 outside Lampedusa, God knows how much between Indonesia and Australia. overland, the South Asians crossing towards Romania, Bulgaria, and so on, and the Afghans and so as well. You know, that is a disease, and it's not being addressed. And that is where, in my opinion, it's reflective of the need for civil society to take up, to expand its role in order to inform, feed, force the system to work. But the system needs, it cannot be just them and us. It has to be us as a totality. And I think that it depends on both in order to do that. There is a kind of prototype we had worked on when I was in my last years at the Secretariat. We had worked on a prototype for the Council. We drew up a council, and that became horribly serious because it was reflected in one of the 2 reports that Kofi had, which is to have a council of the whole with 2 chambers. One chamber made up of civil society in the total sense, and the other one made up of the mechanisms, the treaties and rapporteurs, basically very grosso modo. But the role of the 2 chambers was to contribute agenda items to the council in the center of the whole, and to get feedback. In other words, they would participate in drawing up the agenda and getting the feedback from the council. So the council would not just be left alone to, I mean, they do their best they can, but they have dried up their ground so badly that they are really, you know, if you look at the liturgical part of the council, you will see a high-level thing. And when we first got a head of state to come to one of them just died, Jaruzelski. He was one of the first ones to come to the commission for good reason in the early 80s. But they were, now it's fine, it's good that there are heads of state there, and it's good that there are ministers who come and beautiful, you know, kind of important things, and then focal dialogue. It is not bad, but not to the detriment of excluding the reality to be discussed and acted upon. And that's where the problem is, I think.
Thank you. I think we need to wrap up. Maybe just the last couple of burning questions, and then we'll wrap up, yeah?
If you have any other questions, you will get my email. Okay.
Please.
But Nidal had one. Please.
Yeah. Go ahead.
I'm a representative of AB's Outlook student newspaper, and I'm not very much indulged in human rights issues, but I attended 2 weeks ago a talk with regards to civil society in Syria, and it was moderated by Mr. Hamza. Part of the talk was about how civil society in Syria was a little bit oppressed before the regimes, during Assad's regime earlier on. If civil society is really oppressed, how can we really expand the role? The government itself is not willing to empower its civil society. So how can we really expand civil society's role if the government is not willing? And if the government is not willing, then that means it's not even interested in improving the human rights situation. And especially right now in Arab Spring, I just want to know your opinion with regards to how human rights can be more expanded, especially during Arab Spring.
Yeah, go ahead. Nidal, you want to say?
Yes, John. I don't want to be a party pooper at the end, but I mean, if we go back to this political analysis of the development of the international system, putting into perspective the UN as a naturalist body fitting there, but in reality then reflecting the realist school in terms of allocation of power. This could diffuse a little bit of our frustration, because we end up talking to the like-minded people, I would say, or groups, and then we try to improve the tools, and we manage to improve the tools, but we do not change the rules of the game. So how do you see to break this vicious circle, taken that again, if you look, yes, the human rights system within the UN improved, developed, changed its tools, but at the end, even the UN itself and the UN family is reflecting this political reality and the real politique, taking the people, the DPA and the political advisor and that at the top, and the human rights. You mentioned it yourself in Iraq. You mentioned in Yemen, which are at the end of the day the political agenda of the real, reflecting the allocation of power of states at the end of the day is there. We are struggling within our own cocoon, or trying to find there, but we are not getting out of it. We're improving it with some names and terminology by moving the commission to become a council. But where are, back to Fatah issue of enforcement, and back to the international criminal justice and enforcement. We were too progressive, too developed in Kampala. Even before Kampala, we talked about very nice things, look at the ICC, struggling with the minimum of cooperation, even with UN Security Council authorizations.
Okay, thank you. When you speak of civil society, be prepared to have a big range from the gangsters to the saints. Okay, and some are pure, some are Maltine, you know, a little bit mixed. So, and that's what makes it effective. Some are friends to the government, you have Congos, you know, and so on. Well, my advice is very simple. First of all, there are umbrella groups. FIDH comes to mind now, but there are several others. So NGOs who have a problem, human rights NGOs who have a problem of that kind, do have ways of getting the message across. We did a lot of that when I was secretary to the commission. I should have been fired many times, because I used to encourage NGOs from situations we did not know about it. So there are networks, and that's not a problem. But it is essential that they do. But there again, of course, I mean, nothing is simple in human rights. One has to see the colors, you know, the shades, as it were. But that is, but it's a vital. As I said earlier, I believe that under situations of repression, civil society has a very vital role to play. I come quickly to my experience in Iraq. When my job in Iraq, when I was sent there in 2004, was to open the office, set up a program, recruit people, establish the human rights office into the, before I got there under Sergio Portras-Soul, it was a human rights and rule of law office. And I insisted with my colleagues in OSCHR to drop the rule of law, just concentrate on human rights. Rule of law will come, we can talk about, but not keep the focus wide. And among the other things, one of the things we had to do was to network with the newly emerging Iraqi civil society. So we were in Asamawa, we were in Nasiriyah, we were in Erbil, of course, we were in Baghdad, naturally. And through some other institutions, we could reach Bakuba and all the others, but physically we were all able to contribute because of security and so on. But, and women's groups, they're strongest. And Iraq had two big organizations. One was the Victims of Torture, the National Association, and the other one was under the victims of the repression, I think of Saddam victims or something. But they were also very big. And they were political, they were anti whatever it was, you know, they had been badly beaten by Saddam because of the situation after the withdrawal of Kuwait and so on. But the result was very encouraging. Today, many of them are still working very well. Again, you know, different shades. But what you have to look at is their link to the reality on the ground. Are they reaching those people who are begging in the streets? Are they reaching those people who have no shelter? Are they reaching to those kids who are running around, you know, trying to make a buck out of nothing? That is what you have to look at. And my God, Afghanistan is another one. When I was there in the 80s, the Taliban were our friends. We were, you know, they were nice guys. And they had a hospital where they made, what do you call them, limbs, artificial limbs. Nida's comments about the emergence of, I mean, you know, you sound like a Cadillac when you speak. You know, you're talking about the ICC, crimes against humanity, and I'm glad, because I am still with the Fiat Cinquecento. In the sense that human rights has advanced dramatically. And one of the most important achievements was the International Criminal Court, especially the definition of crimes, human rights crimes, as crimes against humanity. I remember in my early days in the late 60s, this was almost like an abstract inshallah theory, you know. And now we're actually seriously, okay, maybe the punishment is not big enough, maybe the Hague is a little bit soft or too deluxe, I don't know, bourgeois, but it's being addressed. So I admire very much that evolution as a positive evolution, that we are able today to look at the was the justiciability of human rights violations. Even though, as I said a minute ago, I would rather prefer to focus on the disease prevention rather than trying to band-aid it a little. Because look what happened. Somebody has massacred, I don't know how many hundreds of thousands, and he goes to prison for 5 years. Big deal. And where? In The Hague. Geez, you know, imagine having his laundry done probably and so on.
5-star.
5-star.
John, thank you very, very much. I think.
You mean that's all?
Yes, I think we need to be wrapping up here.
Can't I talk
know
more?
you could talk the rest of the evening, but you have me for that. I think one of the things that very clearly I take away from John's talk is again going back to what actually helped the entire human rights system take place anyway, which is civil society. If it were not for civil society at the global level, we would not have the human rights system today. I'm convinced of that, and history shows that. And that also means that putting our trust and faith and energy into civil society at the national as well as the global level, perhaps it has a better chance at getting some results out and moving things forward. John, thank you so very, very much for joining us today. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you very much. Thank you. What should I do?